Débat. The honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to stand in this House to speak to Bill C-4, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code, the Parliamentary Employment and Staff Relations Act, the Public Service Relations Act, and the Income Tax Act. This act will finally repeal the devastating attack that the Conservative government launched against working people across this country. The two bills that will be repealed were known in the 41st Parliament as Bill C-377 and C-525. These bills were not only mean-spirited attacks on unions, but they were, as Jack Layton said in his last speech to the House, part of a larger agenda by a government that preyed on the concept of dividing Canadians one from the other. New Democrats fought relentlessly against these Conservative anti-union bills, and we certainly welcome the changes of the new Liberal government. I remember when Bill C-377 was pushed through Parliament against the tide of not just labour organizations, but also constitutional and privacy experts. There was opposition from the insurance and mutual fund industry, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, and even the Canadian Bar Association, including the National Hockey League's Players Association. Now, to go on about the constitutionality of the bill. The Conservatives were never good at working within our Constitution. They constantly went head-to-head with the judiciary in this country, losing big battles whenever they put Conservative legislation before Canadian constitutional values. They lost on mandatory minimums, time-served sentencing, and even tried to break a rule to allow a judge, an ineligible judge, to sit on the Supreme Court of Canada. A few years ago, a whistleblower from the Department of Justice brought to light the fact that the government was not fully vetting their legislation to see if it was constitutional or not. So when Bill C-377 was tabled, it came as no surprise that the Privacy Commissioner of Canada stated that the bill would ultimately be defeated by the courts because it went against the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This bill would violate freedom of association and the private lives of those workers who were unionized. Now on to the details of C-377. It was a law that was discriminatory and imposed onerous and detailed reporting requirements on labor organizations. It was designed as a method to crush union finances and bury any action under bureaucratic red tape. Unions already do fully transparent reporting to their membership, as do many organizations and other associations that this bill did not cover. Labor organizations were suddenly going to be subject to public, outside of their membership disclosure to everyone. No other association would be forced to do anything similar. Why were the unions the only ones targeted? What about the clubs, the think tanks, religious organizations, and even the Council of Chief Executives? They were all left out. Law societies and the Canadian Medical Association were also not subject to this law. It was a bill that was designed as a clear attack on workers' rights. Bill C-377 was not only an ill-advised method of dividing Canadians, it was also extremely expensive. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, a position I might add that was created by the Conservative government, stated that it would cost the Canada Revenue Agency approximately $21 million to establish the electronic database for the first 2 years and approximately $2.1 million per year for subsequent years. The bill was so contentious that even Conservative Party senators fought against it. And I should note the Conservative Hugh Segal, who, among other things, mentioned that it would violate the privacy of millions, it would tilt the advantage towards employers during negotiations, and is basically a declaration of war against workers. That came from Conservative Senator Hugh Segal. And he felt it was unconstitutional, it was discriminatory, and it was not even a dignified way to govern this country. Repealing this bill will save millions of dollars annually, both for the government and for labor organizations. Bill C-525 was a law designed to harm and diminish unions by making it much more difficult for workers to collectively form a union and making it much easier for a union to be decertified. The government pushed hard for these private members' bills back in the day to be passed. This marked a trend by Conservatives to take contentious attacks and placed them in private members' bills so they were subject to less scrutiny and debate than full government legislation would have had to follow. Many stakeholders who were directly affected by the legislation have also applauded the government for its plan to repeal the two private members' bills. The President of the Canadian Labour Congress has been clear that these pieces of legislation were nothing more than an attempt to undermine a union's ability to do important work like protecting jobs, promoting health and safety in the workplace, and advocating on behalf of all Canadian workers. Now, the benefits of unions. Conservatives, in their attempt to divide Canadians, have always liked to attack unionized workers as somehow like they are the privileged of Canadian society who do nothing to help the non-unionized. The truth, of course, Mr. Speaker, is very different. Workers in unions spend their paychecks in local communities like mine in Cowichan-Malahat-Langford. Their incomes support local businesses, and they bolster our tax base, which adds to everyone's quality of life. The benefits that are often enjoyed by unionized workers attract and support crucial care infrastructure like dentists, therapists, opticians, and family lawyers to help build vibrant communities. Not to mention that the money that unionized workers contribute to their pension plans comes back to them so that they can spend it in the community. It also means that fewer workers need to rely on family or social programs to get by. When unions have the power to stand up for fairness, they raise the bar for everyone. We can thank the labor movement for their victories in securing parental leave, workplace safety standards, minimum wages, vacation pay, and protection from discrimination and harassment for all workers in this country. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, that these laws had to go, and we applaud the Liberals for being on the correct side of this fight and for quickly moving to repeal this legislation. We also know that the struggle for fair working conditions is far from over. New Democrats will continue to push the government to restore and enhance collective bargaining rights as well as fairer working conditions for all Canadians. The fight continues as our very own NDP member from Jonquière is proposing anti-scab legislation to ensure fairness and balance in labour negotiations. The prohibition against using replacement workers protects the interests of working Canadians and their families against the might of large, powerful, and global employers. The New Democratic Party has deep roots in the lives of working people. Our party, after all, was created out of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and the Canadian Labour Congress to be the voice of the regular working family. We follow that tradition closely, as we are proud not only of being a unionized political party where our employees have a say in their workplace. The Liberals should be applauded for working in Parliament to give collective bargaining rights to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and we trust that they will continue this trend and work with their own employees to grant them collective bargaining rights as well. Workers in my community have brought to my attention that there are more and more part-time contractual employees in the riding, and more needs to be done to protect them. The last review of the Canada Labour Code was done 10 years ago in 2006. There were recommendations that came out of that review which would have specifically helped precarious and part-time workers in my riding, but which were never fully implemented. New Democrats will be working hard to push the Liberals on acting on these recommendations. Part-time and contractual employees deserve the same fairness that we all demand for workers across this country. The Canada Labour Code needs to be updated and modernized. There are sections of the code which are at least 60 years out of date. Repealing both 377 and 525 are important first steps, but it is important that we do not sit back and congratulate ourselves, as sections of our Canada Labour Code dealing with harassment, hours of work, overtime pay, and vacation entitlements need major updates. When Tommy Douglas was the Premier of Saskatchewan, he knew that securing basic workers' rights was key to a just and prosperous society. He knew that he was able to get ideas from working people to implement them for the benefit of all. Tommy passed legislation establishing a 40-hour work week, paid vacations, and collective bargaining rights for all workers. Conservatives have tried to turn back the clock and strip workers of the vested rights they fought so hard to achieve. We now have much to do to enshrine protections for working families across this country. Working people in my riding know that repealing C-377 and 525 are the important first steps, and that the Democrats will be there to hold the government's feet to the fire to ensure that we continue bettering the lives of workers from coast to coast to coast. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Cape Breton-Canso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my colleague from the NDP. Welcome to the chamber, and I'm sure as he starts his career here in the House of Commons, there'll be many issues that we'll disagree on, but certainly on this one here, we are very much like-minded. Just as we went through the study on 377, there were a number of comments that were made regarding the legislation, saying that this was the same legislation for the most part. George Bush brought this in as the Republican legislation in the United States, and we were able to witness one of the claims that was filed by just a standard claim that was filed in the United States, and it was like 745 pages. 745 pages. It was a pretty impressive document. The charity in Canada that records the highest amount of revenue, there's a hospital in Toronto. When they file, they would have one of the most comprehensive, one of the most detailed filings for a charity in the country. Was 24 pages. Pretty impressive when they're stacked up beside each other. So the Conservatives contended that this was just about openness and clarity. Would he see, and we asked charities to do that, does he see the difference between, what was being asked, what is asked of charities, but what was being asked of organized labor? Does he see that there was something else behind the motivation other than openness and transparency?
The honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly appreciate the question from my colleague across the aisle. Absolutely, there was something behind this. Any time that you had to subject one single organization to this kind of onerous paperwork, obviously the thing that was behind it all was to tie them up into red tape and to make a union an ineffective voice for the workers in their particular jurisdiction. And so absolutely, I do agree with you. There certainly was a method, and the very fact that these same rules were not applied to other professional associations, other types of clubs, other religious organizations, but that it was only unions that were singled out by this bill. And the fact that they are already extremely accountable to their workers. Workers can replace the leadership of the union if they're not doing a good job. They have to open their finances. They have to do reporting to the CRA already. This bill was just simply another level of red tape to completely kneecap them. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And my question to the member is, we talk about the importance of labour and management relations, and it's something in which, as government, whether it's federal or provincial, we should be encouraging harmony and consensus wherever we can. It's healthy for the Canadian economy when we see that harmony within. My question to the member is in relation to jurisdiction. We have seen many labour laws look towards provincial jurisdiction. For example, there's anti-scab legislation that has been introduced at a provincial level. And I'm wondering if the member can provide some thoughts or his comments in regards to the importance of respecting some of the provincial jurisdictional issues, in particular and with respect to some of the labour laws that we have in society or in Canada today, and not to underestimate the importance of provincial government's role in that area.
The honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I know my honourable colleague from Jonquière will be introducing a bill for anti-scab legislation, and I certainly think that she is much more qualified than I am to defend her particular bill. But when it comes to respecting jurisdiction between the federal realm and the provincial realm, Absolutely, Madam Speaker. I do believe that we do have to have a crystal clear definition between the two. However, I also think that there's an important role for the federal government to play in leadership, Madam Speaker, and that's why the NDP was proud to stand for a $15 hour minimum wage, because we knew it would encourage provincial jurisdictions to follow suit. Similarly, if we show the same leadership in the federal arena, we're hoping our provincial cousins will also follow suit. Thank you, Madam Speaker.